Growing up, I learned the meaning of sacrifice before I even knew what the word meant. My parents, Michael and Linda, were hardworking but constantly drowning in financial burdens. My father worked as a mechanic during the day and drove a taxi at night. My mother took on sewing jobs from home while taking care of me. No matter how much they tried, it was never enough. I still remember the eviction notices taped to our apartment door. The nights I pretended to be asleep while my parents whispered in the kitchen, their voices laced with worry over how to make rent. The times my mother lied, saying she wasn't hungry, just so I could have the last bit of food on our plate. We lived paycheck to paycheck. Vacations, new clothes, even small luxuries like eating out were distant dreams. While other kids had birthday parties at arcades or theme parks, my birthdays were quiet affairs. A homemade cake if we could afford the ingredients, and maybe a small toy from a thrift store. But despite everything, my parents never let me feel unloved. They always told me that education was my way out. "You're smart, Alex," my father would say. "One day you'll make something of yourself." And I believed them. I worked harder than anyone around me. I studied under streetlights when the electricity got cut off. I took on part-time jobs from the moment I was old enough. First as a grocery bagger, then as a dishwasher, and eventually anything that paid. By the time I graduated from college, I had earned a degree in finance. Not because I loved numbers, but because I wanted to make sure my parents never had to struggle again. I landed a stable job, worked my way up, and started saving every penny I could. I made a choice. I wouldn't live for myself until my parents had the life they deserved. For over a decade, I watched every dollar. No vacations, no luxury purchases, not even an occasional splurge. While my coworkers upgraded their apartments, drove new cars, and traveled the world, I lived in a tiny rundown studio with secondhand furniture and a mattress on the floor. I packed lunches instead of eating out. I walked instead of taking taxis. Every time I thought about spending money on myself, I remembered my mother's tired hands, my father's hunched back, and the nights they cried over unpaid bills. So I saved. After 15 years of relentless work, I finally had enough. $280,000, enough to buy my parents the home they always dreamed of. I still remember the day I told them. I took them out for dinner. Our first real dinner at a restaurant, something we had never done before. I handed them the house listing with a smile on my face. "It's yours," I said. My mother gasped. My father blinked in shock. My mother started crying right there at the table. "Alex, we can't accept this. It's too much." But I insisted. I told them they had sacrificed everything for me, and now it was my turn to give back. That night I took them to see the house. It was perfect. A cozy 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood. A front yard where my mother could plant her favorite flowers. A garage where my father could tinker with old cars without worrying about space. A warm, welcoming place where they could finally live without fear of eviction or unpaid rent. Seeing their joy made every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every missed opportunity worth it. I felt fulfilled. I had done it. For the first time in my life, I believed everything was going to be okay. Little did I know, I was about to experience the most heartbreaking betrayal of my life. The first few months after my parents moved into their new home were wonderful. My mother called me every day, telling me about how she was decorating the living room or how my father was fixing the fence. I visited often, helped them clean, and enjoyed family dinners, something we had never truly had before. But then things started to change. My mother's calls became less frequent. When I called, she always seemed in a hurry, finding excuses to end the conversation quickly. When I visited, the atmosphere felt strange. My parents were no longer as warm as before. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite explain. One day I decided to stop by unannounced. As I approached the house, I heard voices inside. My mother's voice was filled with worry. "Are you sure this is okay? What if Alex finds out?" I froze. A sinking feeling gripped my chest. I pushed the door open. My mother flinched and my father immediately looked away. I demanded to know what was going on, but they brushed it off, saying I must have misheard. I tried to push aside my doubts, convincing myself that I was overthinking. But then the truth came out in a way I never could have expected. A few weeks later, at a family gathering, I overheard my uncle talking to someone. His voice carried over the chatter and laughter. "Mark is so lucky. His parents just gave him a brand new house and he didn't have to spend a dime." Mark. My heart clenched. Mark was my half-brother, my father's son from his first marriage. We were never close. He had always been reckless, spending money carelessly, drowning in gambling and debt. While I spent my youth working tirelessly, he wasted his life relying on others to bail him out. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. I left the gathering immediately, my mind racing, and drove straight to my parents' house. When I arrived, my mother opened the door looking nervous. I couldn't hold back my anger anymore. "Tell me the truth. Whose name is on the house?" My mother lowered her head, saying nothing. My father sighed and, in a chillingly calm voice, said, "We signed the house over to Mark." It felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath me. I couldn't breathe. I had spent 15 years of my life sacrificing everything, giving up my dreams, working relentlessly to provide for them, only for them to hand over the house to someone who didn't deserve it? Why? My voice cracked. I worked myself to the bone to buy that house. I gave up my entire life savings. My mother started crying, but my father remained disturbingly composed. "Mark is the eldest son. He deserves a house. And you're successful, you can always make that money back." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I turned to my mother, praying she would say something, hoping she would defend me. But all she did was whisper through her tears, "We thought you would understand." Understand? How could I ever understand such betrayal? I walked out of the house in a daze, my mind spinning. But I wasn't done. I needed to see Mark. I found him at a bar, laughing with his friends as if nothing had happened. I stormed over and dragged him outside. "How did you get the house?" I growled. Mark shrugged, smirking. "Mom and Dad gave it to me. They said I needed it more than you." I clenched my fist. "Do you have any idea how hard I worked for that money? Do you know what I sacrificed?" He shrugged again, completely indifferent. "You're an idiot. You always knew they favored me. Why were you expecting anything different?" I just took what they offered. I felt my entire body tremble with anger. I had once believed that my parents loved me. I had once believed that my sacrifices meant something. But in the end, they saw me as nothing. I walked away, leaving Mark behind with his mocking laughter. After that day, I cut off all contact with my family. I stopped calling, stopped visiting, and no longer cared about their lives. But then, for the first time in months, I heard news that made me smile. Mark had started mortgaging the house for loans. He had fallen back into gambling, piling up debt. A few months later, the house was foreclosed. My parents panicked, calling me nonstop. They begged for my help, saying they had nowhere else to go. But I only gave them one response. "I thought you would understand." And I hung up. They had made their choice. Now they had to live with the consequences of their betrayal. And for the first time in my life, I chose myself. Even after I hung up, the calls kept coming. Text messages filled with pleas, belated apologies, and even accusations. "You can't treat your parents like this. We are family." Family? I laughed bitterly. Family is not a place where someone betrays the child who sacrificed everything. Family is not where one person's devotion is used as a reward for someone else. I didn't reply. All I did was move on without them. I focused on my work. I started taking care of myself, traveling, something I had never dared to do before. I enjoyed peaceful evenings without the burden of responsibility for anyone but myself. Meanwhile, my family fell apart. The one who had stolen everything from me finally got what he deserved. He treated the house like a poker chip, borrowing money from loan sharks, digging himself deeper into gambling and addiction. But before long, he lost everything. The bank took the house. With nowhere else to go, he moved back in with my parents in a tiny rental apartment. A cramped, run-down place, even worse than where I grew up. I heard that Mark had tried reaching out to me, but I no longer cared. After losing the house, my parents tried one last time to beg for my help. This time I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt anymore. I felt nothing. I agreed to meet them, once. In a small cafe, my mother sobbed while my father sat silently, his proud demeanor gone. "Alex, we were wrong. But you're our son. Please just help us one more time." I looked at them, feeling like I was staring at strangers. "You chose Mark over me," I said calmly. "So let Mark take care of you." I stood up and left, leaving them clinging to the hope that I was still the naive, self-sacrificing son they once knew. But I wasn't. I was no longer the fool who gave everything only to be betrayed. 5 years passed. I built a new life for myself. I had a job I loved, I bought my own home, one that no one could take away from me. I had real friends who truly valued me. And my parents? I never spoke to them again. Occasionally, I heard through others that they had grown older, weaker, struggling financially. But that was no longer my burden. Mark. He sank further into debt, failing in the life he thought he could have without ever working for it. Looking back, I realized the hardest lessons I had to learn, paid for with blood, tears, and years of my life. Never sacrifice yourself for people who don't appreciate you. If someone truly loves you, they will never take your sacrifices for granted. Family is not just about blood. It's about who truly deserves your trust. Just because someone is related to you doesn't mean they won't betray you. Sometimes the best revenge is letting go. I didn't need to destroy my parents or Mark. They ruined their own lives. Putting yourself first is not selfish. It's necessary. I had spent too long living for others. It was time to live for myself. What do you think about this story? If you were in my position, would you have forgiven your parents? Have you ever been betrayed by someone you loved and trusted? Do you believe karma always comes at the right time? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective.